and is an accomplished scholar and author of several books and articles on various aspects of developments in the Gulf region, especially on Saudi Arabia and Oman. He speaks multiple languages and is one of the most recognized contemporary scholar on the Arab world today. Today, we are going to, he's going to speak on the theme for today's discussion is social transformations in Saudi Arabia after 2015. And if you ask me as a student of Saudi Arabia, as a person who has studied Saudi Arabia for his PhD and has been a student of Saudi Arabia for the past few years, this is one of the most important issues as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned. There is a significant misunderstanding of how Saudi society is, what kind of transformation it has undergone over decades, and what kind of transformation which it is currently undergoing. And there is no person better than Professor Joseph Kechichian to speak to us on this issue. Today, we are going to have two lectures. The first lecture is on the dynamics of social change in Saudi Arabia. So may I now invite Professor Joseph Kechichian to give his lecture.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And for those of you who came back from yesterday, welcome back. I hope it was not too bad yesterday. So I see many of you back here. So at least I'm doing something right to bring you back. Ahla wa sahla, as they say in Arabic. Today's lecture is a bit complicated, but before I start, the same rules that I have mentioned yesterday apply today as well. I am giving you my own personal views. Do not assume that I'm speaking for either the government of Saudi Arabia or the King Faisal Center. So far, so good, right? These are my own views. I can hang on what I say. I'm ready to hang on what I say, all right? Now, today's lecture is a bit complicated, and I'm going to borrow from one of my colleagues by the name of Sara Al-Muhammadi, who has done quite a bit of work on women's issues. The fact that I'm a man is a handicap when it comes to studying women's issues, so I have to rely on my female colleagues at the center to help me out. So some of the things that I'm going to say are originally her ideas, but she knows that I'm here, she knows that I'm giving this presentation, and I have her blessing. And I will talk about women's issues, and I want to talk about minorities and refugees in the second part of this discussion later on in the afternoon, but the two of them are very much tied. When I talk about dynamic social change in the kingdom, I'm really talking about the new morality of Saudi Arabia. The new morality of Saudi Arabia. Things are changing in the kingdom from a very conservative, very closed environment where everything is regulated, has been like that for centuries, to a totally different era. So therefore, what I'm going to do in the first part of this discussion, before we move on to the women's issues and the refugees and demographic data and so on and so forth, here I'm going to talk about the economization of morality and how this is changing and how the government, within Vision 2030, about which we will talk a great deal tomorrow, even morality is being now economized, financial. Even morality is taking on financial aspects, and I'll explain that to you. But I wanted at the outset for you not to be entirely put out of what I'm about to say, because it's a bit theoretical, but you will follow what I'm saying. It will help you clarify the second part better when you understand how this moralization process is changing. Now, as I'm sure you've heard before, Saudi Arabia has always been known for its conservative character and religious policing of the public sphere. Until very recently, until 2017, you had the mutawwa'in, the religious police that used to go around town calling people to prayer 5 times a day. It was religious policing, no question about that. And of course, it derives its Islamic identity from being the home of Islam's 2 holiest cities, Mecca and Medina. Its Islamic identity is cemented into the political structure, as I mentioned yesterday, in 1744, where Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab joined forces with Muhammad bin Saud, and the alliance that they've created has endured, and it has created a division of labor between political authority and religious authority, whereby the descendants of both families, the Al Saud and the Al Sheikh, Muhammad Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad bin Saud, and their descendants essentially administered the socio-religious domain of the kingdom. The religious folks managed the socio-religious dynamics of society, and the Al Saud family members and their descendants managed the political realm. There was a clear division of labor between the two sides. The ultimate power, of course, always in the hands of the king, no question about that, but the king derives his legitimacy from Islamic identity. In 1992, the country passed a basic law of governance, and Article 1 of that says the kingdom's constitution is Almighty God's book, the Holy Quran, and the Sunnah, the traditions of the Prophet. Article 7 of the 1992 Basic Law stipulates that all state laws must be based on Sharia, which is Islamic law. Sharia is Islamic law. One of the main sources of Sharia is the fatwas, the religious decrees that religious men deliver. Not everybody can deliver this. Don't assume that every sheikh can issue a fatwa. Of course, they can issue fatwa. Nobody pays attention to them. The real fatwas are issued by the Council of Senior Scholars, a group of learned men, the ulama, if you would like, who, after 2016, changed the entire equation. Before 2016, social conduct had been regulated, for the most part, by such fatwas that were issued by various individuals about how one appeared, behavior in public settings, and so on and so forth. Although these decrees were never translated into a legal code, they were never, before 2016, the fatwas, the decrees that were issued about behavior, about conduct, about dress code, and everything, they never were codified in legal terms. They nevertheless provided the necessary ideological foundation for what was known as the Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, the so-called CPVPV, or the committee for short, the Mutawwa'in, as I mentioned, which acted as a religious police that oversaw moral order in the public sphere. Under Section 3 of the Saudi Basic Law of Governance, which identifies the foundations of Saudi society, Articles 9 to 13 refer general responsibilities that the lawmaker has taken upon himself to safeguard the religiosity and values of citizens, which is what the committee is mandated to do. However, the committee operated and it enforced social and religious norms without relying, I repeat this, without relying on a legal code. There was no legal code, nor were there a system of penalties. If somebody breached the code or breached the fatwa, what were the penalties? Nobody knew what the penalties was. Public morality and religious policing remained the responsibility of the committee until 2016, when it was totally relieved of its duties by the decree that Mohammed bin Salman issued. In 2016, King Salman, as he came into power, settled. Saudi Arabia witnessed at that time a change in the dynamic of the relationship between the state and the religious establishment. Historically, the state typically deferred to the ulama, the senior scholars, within the Council of Senior Religious Scholars, on major policy areas that regulate public life. However, starting in 2016, as the state introduced its new scheme to diversify the economy, Vision 2030 and all its planks, it adopted a more hands-on approach to determining the specifics of such policy areas. In 2019, for example, the Council of Ministers issued a new law to regulate social conduct in public, such as dress and appearance. It's now referred to as the Decency Code. The Decency Code, or for short, the Code. There is now a code, okay? Technically, it's known as the Decency Code, but nobody refers to it as such. They just say the code. The new code stipulates 19 violations. It's very specific. It says there are 19 violations that could incur fines. If you breach these codes, you have to pay a fine, mostly addressing public order and physical appearance. When the law was announced, local and international observers saw this as a return to religious policing. However, unlike previous forms of control, which relied heavily on religious language, the new code refrained from making any explicit reference to Sharia or to Islam. I want that to sink in for a second. Before 2019, public order and the dynamics of society are based on Sharia in its entirety, as applied by the committee, CPV-PV, Mutawwa'in. After 2019, a decency code comes in that does not refer to Sharia, does not refer to Islam, but has 19 violations specified, mostly on appearance and dress. Instead, one of the two law made references, for example, to social values, principles, and identity, while Article 3 ordered respect for values, traditions, and local cultural norms. Local cultural norms. More interestingly, Article 7 of the Code delegated the administrative and regulatory functions of the law to the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Tourism. All of a sudden, we're no longer talking about the Ministry of Religious Affairs. We're talking about the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Tourism. Some observers might well argue that the Decency Code was enacted as part of a larger scheme to secularize the law and the public sphere, to make it a lot more secular than it has been. However, a more likely scenario stipulates that the code, within a broader attempt to inject an economic logic into the Saudi legal system. In fact, it might be accurate to state that in recent years, the government has gradually shifted towards a more fiscally prudent justice system, one whose central aim is to increase profit and eliminate high maintenance costs. Now, of course, I should stop here briefly and interject something. Just because there was an old system doesn't mean it was cost-free. It cost a lot of money to keep the committee going. 150,000 people, more or less, plus support staff, drivers, etc. That's not cheap. Where does the money come from? The money comes from the state. The state provides this assistance. Now, Sarah Al-Muhammadi, and I agree with her, has thought out that this Vision 2030 plank to reform the society's dynamics and to codify important social behavior in a code is also fiscally responsible. You have to pay your way. In other words, if you breach a particular code, there is a penalty. That penalty is fiscal. You have to pay a fine. You have to pay either in cash or with check or Google Pay or Apple Pay, I don't know, but you have to pay. There's nothing for free anymore. All right. I'm going slow on this because I want this to sink in. This is a sensitive topic and we have to really get a grip on it. The changes of the justice system appear to be in line, as I say, to restrict access to welfare, impose new service fees, and value-added taxes. Fines are usually imposed to benefit the victim, even if the state seems to be the primary beneficiary because collected fines go directly into the treasury. Moreover, and this must be stated as clearly as possible, the imposition of fines in general affect the poor and may be particularly burdensome to women, though these may be unintentional consequences. Not that women are breaching the code more often than others. Of course, because of the restrictions on women and the code of their dress that has changed now, women will pay a heavier price because if they decide that they were going to disobey the code and they will wear different clothes, obviously there is a fine for that. So you have to pay attention to what goes on. Now, when this was introduced, in one single weekend in 2009, 60 reported violations were collected. 60. And 37 of the penalties were issued against women, likely for violating the dress code, mostly women who did not cover their hair. Most women in Saudi Arabia before 2019 were obligated to cover their hair with a hijab. Not a niqab to the face, but a hijab. In certain cities of Saudi Arabia, very conservative, like Qasim and others, women do wear the facial mask, the niqab. But in most of Saudi Arabia, Saudi women now usually wear a hijab. They cover their hair. Less so in Jeddah. Jeddah is a much more cosmopolitan city where even Saudi women no longer wear hijab in public. Of course, I'm talking all in public. In private, none of this applies. But obviously, in this particular, when the code was introduced, there were violations, and 37 of them were against women. Since the law did not provide any specific guidance to what constituted a decent attire, it said you have to have a decent attire. It didn't say what decent meant. Whether the hijab was decent or no hijab was decent, we don't know. So therefore, it was up to, the matter was left entirely to the policemen or the security personnel involved, which underscored its subjective features, obviously. Moreover, and though the new law was advertised as a regulatory code for tourists and locals alike, penalties were only imposed on local women and men too. Now, of course, in Saudi Arabia, Western women who, before these codes were introduced, used to wear a abaya, a long dress that covered their body, usually in the color black. Western women and I should not say Western, I should say non-Arab women, non-Saudi women, were not obligated to cover their hair by wearing a hijab. They could do without. Now, this applied also to Saudi women. Not only you didn't have to wear a hijab, you didn't have to wear a abaya. You could just wear a dress or pants and go out in public. And a lot of people did that. And that's why all of a sudden there were all these arrests, because people were shocked for the first time to see women in normal inside clothes outside. By drawing on the dress code as a case study, it is important to explore and contextualize both the language of the legal code and its implementation. How does one go about doing this? Is the new decency code redefining the citizens' moral obligations in economic terms by commodifying moral offenses under the economic efficiency frame of reference? Those are fair questions to ask. Applying the logic of efficiency to policing the dress code delivers two objectives. First, it generates a direct profit from the fines. It's a source of income, after all. It's indirect taxation. And two, more importantly, it creates uniformity as well as expels any deviance that may disrupt the state's efforts to accumulate capital through global outreach. Consequently, the notion of space is expanded beyond its geographic meaning to include the bodies of the citizens who occupied a particular space, mostly women, of course. During the process of capital accumulation, the state is not only inviting in tourists and investors to explore its land, but also it's capitalizing on the bodies of its own citizens, because presumably all of the bodies that occupy the public sphere must serve a purpose towards the generation of capital. I'm a bit harsh, I know. So is Sarah. Sarah and I had this conversation before. This is a harsh thing to say, that in fact the state is using human beings' bodies essentially to make money out of them. But that's taxation with representation. Representation here being the body of the human being. Now, as you will see in a few minutes, the goals therefore shifts from morality's policing efforts as the new decency code acquires a broader configuration to boost the Saudi legal system in genuine economic terms. Now, I'm going to skip over some of this conversation because it's obviously, it goes back and forth to the different regions of Saudi Arabia. What is acceptable in Najd, in the middle of Saudi Arabia, might not be acceptable in the Hijaz, in Jeddah area, in Mecca area. What might be acceptable to the north might not be acceptable to the south. We will talk about women driving in a few minutes later on today. People assume that Saudi women never drove, for example. This is not true. Saudi women drove outside of the large cities for decades, but they were not allowed to drive inside the big cities. So therefore, as I mentioned yesterday, Saudi Arabia is a very large country, and what happens in the north, it actually takes 3 hours to fly from north to south. It takes 2.5 hours to fly from east to west. So it gives you an idea how big it is. It's a fairly large country, and different regions have their different traditions and different values and so on and so forth. Now, from its inception, the Saudi state, through its legitimizing, as I said, drew its legitimacy from religion, as well as being the custodian of Islam's holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Consequently, Islam articulated much of the country's domestic and foreign policies, and King Abdul Aziz, the founder, invested great efforts to place the kingdom at the center of the Muslim world. In doing so, he forged solidarity between Islamic countries and took the initiative to strip the development of pan-Islamic politics out of the hands of the Ottoman Empire. After World War II, Saudi Arabia rejuvenated its pan-Islamist stance by exporting Salafism to counter the expansion of Arab socialist nationalism, which is Gamal Abdel Nasser, and so on and so forth. Now, Salafism, of course, has a different meaning today than it had. Real Salafism is going back to the books. Real Salafism is applying the Sharia and the Sunnah of the Prophet. Now, of course, a lot of history has happened between then and 2019, and what we have, you have a booming education system. You have lots of Saudis traveling across the world, being exposed to different cultures, being exposed to different civilizations. And the domestic education scene has changed as well. And as you students in this room probably are aware, even those of you who come from very conservative families, when you attend university, you're exposed to other cultures. If you're conservative at home, you're less conservative at the university. Why? because you're exposed to others among your friends and colleagues who might not have the same background as you do, but you learn to be a lot more tolerant of each other. Therefore, your morality does not change, it evolves. Your morality evolves. Same thing happened in Saudi Arabia as well, where you had roughly the education system growing dramatically from numbers that were in the low figures, 400, 500,000, to the millions. We're talking 2 million, 3 million, and more. Now, of course, Salman comes to power in 2015. He has now a new educated population that he has to deal with. Saudis today, when he became king in 2015, were not the same Saudis that his father ruled in 1932. In fact, the Saudi population now has reached such a high level of education. 65% of Saudis are less than 30 years old, and they're all educated. There is no more illiteracy in Saudi Arabia. Maybe it's 1%. 99% of Saudis now are literate and highly educated. They're looking for secure jobs, they're looking for homes, and they're looking for no committee rule, no religious requirements on them. They're looking for freedoms. The more educated you are, the more open-minded you become, the more tolerant you become, the more culturally open-minded you become. The monarch assumed his role as he had political and economic pressure mounting at a time when neighboring countries were dealing with serious instability. And of course, Saudi Arabia was caught in the middle of all of this. And at that time, the United States relationship was increasingly strained, mainly due to Barack Obama's administration, because Barack Obama wanted to have a better relationship with Iran, with the nuclear deal that he entered into. Oil prices fell down dramatically, all the way to $50 in 2015, which meant that the government income was dramatically reduced. We'll talk about economy tomorrow. And Saudi Arabia in 2015 was actually economically in bad shape. Price of oil going down, and everything is increasing in price. The economy needed a new plan, and its dependence on oil was becoming increasingly unsustainable. Now, these domestic realities and global pressures compelled the king and the heir apparent to reevaluate and readjust. Towards that end, one of the first steps the new government embarked upon was to introduce Vision 2030, again, more about that tomorrow, whereby the focus mainly on identifying non-oil sources of revenue, adopt privatization initiatives in several sectors, adopt austerity measures, limit or remove subsidies, all of which drain the treasury. Value-added taxes were imposed for the first time, VAT, along with the enactment of a laundry list of service fees for a variety of items. Soon after, officials began to speak the language of business, with more emphasis on KPIs, key performance indicators, metrics and data collection, measure, and performance. Look where we were, and look where we got now. We were talking about morality, we were talking about decency, codes, we were talking about policing behavior in public, to where we are now talking about metrics, data, income, measures. We need to make more money, we need to encourage entrepreneurship, and so on and so forth. I'm giving you this background because I'm getting someplace, and where I'm getting is to sensitize you to how morality is being economized. What I said at the very beginning, the economization of morality. I'm getting there. Among the many new issues raised by senior representatives was how to raise non-oil sources of revenue precisely to attract foreign direct investments, encourage tourists to visit the country, which was a rare occurrence. When I went to Saudi Arabia back in 1983 for the first time, of course, in those days they did not issue tourist visas. Until very recently, there were no tourist visas. You can go on Hajj and Umrah if you are a Muslim and you want to perform Hajj and Umrah, but you have to have a visa for that as well. And even though lots of people stay on illegally, you're supposed to leave when you complete Hajj and Umrah. You're supposed to go home. I will talk about migration in a few moments. But obviously, now you can apply online for an electronic visa, and you can get it within a matter of a few seconds. They want to encourage people to travel as much as possible. Things have changed dramatically. Now, of course, to attract global investors, the government created highly publicized events like a Future Investment Initiative, so-called PIF. You may have heard about this, or the Davos of the desert, to encourage investors to bring business to Saudi Arabia. They also introduced the bankruptcy law, improved accessibility to business-related legal services, to dispel any concerns of bureaucratic rigidity, as it adopted transparent, business-friendly steps. And one of the most, as I said, the e-visa, which opened the doors to the country. If it was closed for many years, Saudi Arabia was finally promoting itself as a tourist destination. Actually, it's a very beautiful country. If you are into archaeology, you like old history, you will find tremendous artwork in the desert from the Nabatean era, pre-Islamic era, to Al-Ula, which is totally redone now, and all the new projects that they are building in sports, in entertainment, a whole bunch of stuff to encourage people from all over the world to come. Previously, travel to the kingdom was mostly restricted to religious tourism, not anymore, and there are now 49 countries, actually the number is more since this was written last year. Now the number is almost 90 countries where you're entitled to e-visa that is automatic, literally. Now, this is the background. Let's go back to the religious question and traditions. In addition to these initiatives, several social changes were introduced as well, most notably in ushering significant curbs to religious policing in 2016, after decades of unchecked control over the public sphere. Subsequently, women were allowed to drive in 2018 as part of an initiative to bring more women into the workforce and to decrease dependency on foreign drivers whose repatriated earnings contributed to substantial capital flight from the country. Gender segregation in public spaces was also eased. Movie theaters were opened for the first time. Concerts and entertainment events were held across the kingdom to encourage residents to spend their leisure riyals at home and for the overall betterment of the quality of life. Most of these changes were justified in economic terms in the language of Vision 2030. Now, for those of you, excuse me, for those of you who go to the movies, you assume that you've always had the right to go to the movies. Well, if you were in Saudi Arabia before 2017, there were no movie theaters. At one point, there were movie theaters. In the 1960s and 1970s, early, there were movie theaters. They were all shut down in 1979 after the takeover of the Mecca Mosque, when Juhayman Utaybi and a band of his renegade friends stormed the holy city of Mecca, the holy mosque of Mecca, and held hostage several hundred people for 3 weeks. Eventually, authorities liberated the holy mosque and arrested these renegade individuals. Most of them were executed, and movie theaters were banned at that time. Morality took on an entirely different perspective at the time. The country all of a sudden became a lot more conservative. Before 1979, Saudi women used to go to the beach. Okay, segregated beach for women only, but they could wear swimsuits and go swim. After 1979, this was forbidden because of the impact that Juhayman has had on society. Now, all of a sudden, now, after 2017, you have movie theaters, you have concerts, you can actually mix with different genders, and you can have a totally different way of life. Now, let's go back to the law now. At every step, the law has been central to these developments, not only by providing the rules for new systems and a means through which to enforce them, but also by elaborating the ideas used to rationalize them. The law acted as the essential connective tissue between policy and political decisions and the sought-after economic order. In fact, the heir apparent, Mohammed bin Salman, himself pointed to how important the law was to the overall economic order. In an interview he gave, he was asked about the move to codify, for example, the personal status law. For those of you, I will talk about this on Thursday, I guess, right, when we talk about legal reforms. But since I mentioned it now, I will say very briefly, personal status law deals with things like marriage, custody of children in a divorce, inheritance. This is all done by Sharia rules. This is all done by Sharia rules. Has always been like that. Guess what? Not anymore. Now it's codified. There is a personal status law now. There is a code system where precedent takes over. Not every judge can do whatever he or she, whatever he likes to do. There are no female judges yet in Saudi Arabia, but I got news for you. They're starting to have female lawyers who actually go to the court and defend their clients. Again, please appreciate what that means. In a society that was forbidden for a female lawyer to even exist, now the female lawyer goes to the court, stands in front of the judge, who happens to be a male, and defends her client to the best of her ability and argues with the judge. Appreciate what that means. And all of this is happening within a matter of a few years only. So Mohammed bin Salman is asked about this, and his response is the following. Quote, laws are passed based on this procedure according to international conventions. If you want tourists to come here, if you want to aim to attract 100 million tourists to create 3 million jobs per year, and you say that you are following something new other than common laws and international norms, then those tourists will not come to you. If you want to double foreign investments, as we have done, from 5 million to 17 million, and you tell investors to invest in your country that is running on an unknown system that their lawyers do not know how to navigate, nor know how those regulations are applied and enforced, then those investors will just cut their losses and not invest altogether. When you want to attract certain talents and human resources to work in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and say that you have a new invention by enacting laws, by that, of course, he meant judicial ijtihad, no one will come to you, end quote. Let this sink for a second. What is Mohammed bin Salman saying? He is saying, if we want to change, if we want to attract 100 million tourists to come and visit us, if we want foreign direct investors to come, we have to have laws that are clear, that people can see, that people can understand. There is a legal system in place, and our morality fits in that legal system. We're still Muslims. We're not becoming non-Muslims. We are still practicing ijtihad. We're still practicing reasoning. We are still being who we are, but we want to do it in a legal way, in a proper way, in a codified way. where there is transparency, where you understand where I'm coming from. These are my rules. I'm applying the same rules that I would apply wherever I am. You're welcome to come and invest in this country, visit this country, have business ties with this country. The rules are clear. There are no mysteries. And it's not the whim of a particular ruler or a particular legal advisor or a judge to throw you in jail or to arrest you or to hit you in the street because your wife is not covered or because your hair is not covered. None of those things. What he wants is something totally different. This goes beyond revolutionary, actually, when you think about it. It's beyond revolutionary. What he is doing, he's sending messages across the board. He's sending messages to the international community saying, we want to be part of the legal system of the planet. And he's sending a message to his own population saying, you can remain who you are, but you have to evolve. You cannot stay in the 13th century because we're in the 21st. That's a powerful message. And it takes the kind of leadership to be able to articulate those kinds of views in a clear way. I've read what he said. This is translated from the Arabic, of course. And in the Arabic, it's much more powerful. It has a punch. It hits you in the face, literally. His words are very strong, very powerful. I'm going to give you some examples. Mohammed bin Salman, in the same interview, talks about these laws cannot contradict the constitution of Saudi Arabia. The constitution of Saudi Arabia is the Holy Quran. The Holy Quran is the constitution of Saudi Arabia. Therefore, whatever laws we're going to pass, he is saying, don't tell me that I'm going to change my constitution. I'm not going to do that. The Quran still applies. The Sunnah still apply. But I want to evolve. I want to codify it so that I know what I want, and I want you to know what I want, so that there are no misunderstandings between us. You and I are on the same page, and I want to make sure that whatever codes I have are all according to the rules. All right, let me give you an example from Hisbah to Fines. Now, given this fundamental goal that he has, it's fair to ask where the decency code and policing people's public attires fell within this broader context. To better answer such questions, let's briefly examine how public morality is policed prior to 2016 to explain how the enforcement mechanism and the underlying logic of policing changed after the decency code was applied in 2019. If you compare the two periods, it becomes clear that imposing fines on dress code violations, for example, empowers the state to introduce a new justification for its presence within the sphere of moral policing. This is a bit harsh. I understand that. Sarah and I had this argument going back and forth. In fact, she and I co-edited a book on legal reforms in Saudi Arabia, and her chapter on policing, on morality, is so strong that people objected to it, because she's essentially telling that the government is essentially using morality to make money. And that's harsh. That's harsh on her part, but she's entitled to her opinion. I mean, she's a scholar like we are, and she's entitled to her opinion. But the formal religious language of the law and the discourse offered to justify the state's presence within the sphere of moral policing, therefore now is replaced by a neoliberal market logic. So the morality issue in terms of the topic, specific topics, the dynamics of social change in this talk is going into a neoliberal market logic. What are its features? Religious policing, how the committee enforced public morality in the past. CPVPV, the committee, if you'd like, is a social and religious activity that features centrally in the major text of the Quran and the Hadith, and is required by the community as a whole to the act of Hisbah, Hisbah, Hisbah. The traditional idea of Hisbah is to create a form of communal corrective system. A communal corrective system. Hisbah includes a range of different elements, including the monitoring of theft, drug use, public moral, social behavior, very broadly. Therefore, the first modern nation state that created different forms to police different crimes, social conduct, public sphere, was largely left to the committee, which consisted at that time, years ago, of 3,500 personnel that were spread across various regions, responsible for policing the public sphere. They focused mostly on orthodoxy and orthopraxy. This included calling people to prayer, enforcing Islamic dress code, policing any such deviant behavior that committee deemed Islamically and socially inappropriate, such as playing loud music in public, which was forbidden. The committee has also closed shops that sold music cassettes, instruments, music instruments were forbidden. It stopped people in the street who were unusual haircuts, even when these were visible through a ghutra head cover, especially for men who had very long hair, for example, that would show under the ghutra, which is the head cover. If you had your hair showing in the back of you were arrested. But they didn't like that because it's deviant behavior. Why? Because it made the men look like women. That's not acceptable. There have long been calls for the committee to produce a code of moral conduct to prevent their arbitrary behavior, but this has not happened. The person that applies Hisbah is the mutawwa, the committee member. Singular mutawwa, plural mutawwa'in, the committee members. CPVPV, the Committee for the Prevention of Vice and the committee, exactly. However, these calls, as I said, were never met with any serious response from government officials. The committee operated without a specific mandate. It seemed that what it policed depended on multiple factors, persons' own convictions, and the space within which they were operating. There was no clear code, which meant that a lot of cases there was room for negotiations, and many stops were only made to scold or give authoritative advice. Sometimes some confrontations turned out to be pretty violent and deadly. You were lucky. If the committee member that hit you was decent, you gave him 50 riyals, he let you go, bakshish, he let you go. But sometimes you had confrontation, sometimes it was deadly. It was not nice. For example, in 2002, schoolgirls were not allowed to vacate a blazing girls' school because they were not properly dressed. When firefighters reached the school, they were not allowed to enter the school for the same reason. They would be exposed to seeing the faces of young ladies in the school. So the whole place burned down. 15 girls died as a result of that particular event. It was following this incident this is long before Mohammed bin Salman. This is occurring in 2002 when the king is Abdullah, King Abdullah bin Abdul Aziz, about which I spoke yesterday. Following this incident, some cosmetic changes were introduced to regular committee members' zeal. For example, they were now required to wear badges. Before, they were just wearing thobes. You did not know, and they carried a stick. They hit you with it. They were compelled to have some training. They were asked to surrender all apprehended suspects to the police. They're different from the police. They're not the police. They are the committee, religious police, for further actions. However, notwithstanding these requisite changes, one observer concluded that the police generally sympathize with their fellow law enforcers and could be conveniently slow to arrive when called up to pick up suspects. Anyway, I don't want to make a long story, just to say that all of these things, the application of Hisbah in the Saudi state and its institutional incarnation as the committee, remains significant impediment, most importantly, in forging what was the case of a homogeneous society. I was going to use the word conformist society, but to be more polite, I'm using the word homogeneous society. But obviously, same rule applies to everybody, same hisba rules for everybody. This was further compounded by a desire to institutionalize a specific form of religious practice to convey uniformity, as the role hisba played was not a static one. Whenever the state embarked on an attempt to redefine its posture to maintain authority, it redefined the role of the committee, even if no malice was intended. This occurred on numerous occasions, again in 2016, when the committee's policing powers were severely curtailed, with its role becoming almost entirely insignificant. Now, because the committee policed with relative impunity, and because what it policed was generally based on uncodified customary laws, uncodified, you're with me, right? Before 2016, no codes exist. Members implementing their understandings in a way that was arbitrary, to be polite. Even though under Sharia law, fines fell under what is known as discretionary penalties. Sharia law has rules. There are discretionary penalties. Sorry. In Arabic, ta'zir. Discretionary penalties. These are penalties like traffic violations. Usually they never carried fines. There were no fines given on wrongdoings. The officer who dealt with these issues with vice through authoritative, usually give advice. Don't do it again. Please don't do it again. You know, be a nice person. Don't do it again. That's ta'zir, discretionary. With the vast majority of such incidents, maybe 90% of all these cases, the guilty party signs a pledge to cease and desist. I will not commit this offense again, and then go home. In cases where an unmarried couple were found together in public, for example, the woman was taken into the committee's custodies, asked to sign a pledge before her legal guardian was summoned to take her home, and possibly sign an additional pledge on her behalf. Regrettably, such a victim bore the stigma of such horrifying experience because of story would usually become known one way or the other. The male victim, however, would be allowed to go home after signing the pledge with much fewer social repercussions. Now, I want to talk about now the fines, and then I will stop for questions and answer. I want to talk about how the new fines enforce public decency. What has changed? Now, the committee's role has been regulated, which disarmed it politically as well as socially, disarmed even if the institution has not been abolished. The employees remain on the government's payroll. They're at home, all 150,000 of them. They're collecting their salaries, but they're not in the streets anymore. But they're still officially there. In practical terms, it means that the committee will no longer be in charge of policing social and moral behavior. And consequently, after 2019, the new code that was put out no longer was interested in whether or not you were wearing the wrong bracelets, or whether your hair was longer than it's supposed to be. None of these things mattered anymore. Responsibility to enforce the public morality now is on the police, which allowed further security companies to enforce the new code as well. It's critical for the security guard to identify a violation specifically and inform the police authorities to issue a particular fine. The wrongdoer is fined with a smartphone application. You know, you take the smartphone and immediately link to the individual's national identification number, since everybody has an ID number. The wrongdoer can immediately pay the fine through an ATM or on the phone, on the smartphone, whatever fine it is, you pay it. Though everyone could appeal to the relevant administrative court if you want to, if you feel that the fine is not right. The application has had the effect of making the fining process a far more efficient system, but also by making the process seem more natural and invisible. This form of policing posed a practical issue that subjected Saudis and residents to a different, I don't know whether it's more efficient, but a different form of policing, as the application required a national identification number, a residency permit if you are a foreigner, which meant, for the most part, that only Saudis and those with residence permits would receive a fine in the application. In other words, if you're a tourist, you didn't have to worry about that, right? Because you don't have a identification number. So this is unfair for the Saudis and the local residents. To pay their fines, visitors would most likely need to go to a police station to settle them, though how practical that would be, I'll leave it up to your imagination. Which tourist will go to a police office to pay a fine? Theoretically speaking, the introduction of the decency code really constituted an ontological transition from seeing a moral violation as something against God's will into something against the state's will. That's the fundamental social dynamic that has changed under Mohammed bin Salman. I don't want to say it in so many words. I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it in so many words. You heard of the expression separation of church and state? This is what's happening. That's profound. In a country like Saudi Arabia, where tremendous traditions, tremendous values have driven a society for millennia, now you have a clear separation between the state as the enforcer of codes, of rules, properly defined. Social dynamic is changing. You are a member of society. You have responsibilities towards that society. You don't just take from the state, you also give to the state. That's profound and dramatic change. I think I've said enough. I'll wait to continue with some of the other issues with women and migration in the second part. So let's open it up for conversation, discussion amongst us.
Thank you very much, Professor Kechichian. You would all agree that this was a real, masterclass on the dynamics of social change in Saudi Arabia. We are now open for questions. Please introduce yourself and ask precise and to the point questions. Yes, Tuti.
Thank you, sir, for your lecture. So I have two questions. First is on the decency code. So now we also see the nature of abaya has changed. We have designer abayas as global brands trying to tap into the abaya market. How is the state dealing with that changes in the women's clothing per se in terms of the decency code? And secondly, when we talk about women lawyers, for instance, so these are changes that are policy changes, right? But also we are talking about a society that has not given women the kind of freedom that we see in other places. So at a deeper societal level, how has these attitudes changed of the people?
Actually, that's the second part of the presentation. I want to talk about this in the next period. So you're anticipating what I'm about to say, but I'll be happy to answer them.
Yes. Other Kelvin?
Thank you, sir. First of all, thank you, sir, for this amazing presentation. My doubt is that in the last day's session also, you have mentioned about the term tolerance, that Mohammed bin Salman is adopting more tolerant policies. And today you said about the socio-religious liberalization. So my question is that, will it be extended to the foreign residents also? Specifically, will allow to open more places of worship for foreigners who are working and living inside the Saudi? Will it be extended to them?
Yes. So my question is actually a confusion basically. You said that when men grew their hair longer, they were arrested because it was against the code, right? So the code, which was the earlier scenario, was supposedly Islamic, and they were arrested because of the un-Islamic action which was the growing of hair. But on the contrary, we know that the Prophet had longer hair and it could be braided up to the 4 plates. So actually, what is Islamic is basically un-Islamic, and what you call is modern is basically Islamic, because they are like the judges that you're talking about. So according to the Islamic system, we have had female ulamas and judges already, and the lawyers. So what you call modern is actually Islamic, and what they were arresting for un-Islamic was actually not Islamic in the actual sense of the term. So, yes, so how to... Okay. Okay, thank you.
Otherwise, I get confused. One more, and then we'll take another one.
Thank you, sir. I have 3 questions, very short. First is about morality police, how it is different from Iran, and after Iran, the morality police, and then how the protest, that Masa Mini protest, changed the understanding of morality police, whatever the change happening in Saudi society, how it changed those protests and the regulation there were going on, how it changed the Saudi one. And the second question is about that you're saying that the pre-Islamic identity. So about the pre-Islamic identity, there is a notion that it's Jahiliyat. So how this understanding of this Jahiliyat, accepting that it's part of me or it's part of the Saudi national identity, it's like perceived by the state and perceived by the locals. How these things are taking place in the society. And the third question is more like uh, as you mentioned about that Makkah siege and how it changed the society, that it was not that conservative, but it became conservative. So are you saying that if something like that, a small incident that, okay, if Saudi society will feel that there is an attack, on my identity, so it's become more conservative. So are we waiting for that moment in the future so that it can go back to become more conservative in future? Thank you.
I'll start with this last point. That's an excellent question. Thank you. This question of identity we touched upon yesterday a little bit, and Saudi society now is struggling with this new identity, and it has now gotten to the point where they are celebrating both traditions, pre-Islamic traditions, as well as Islamic traditions. It's an amalgamation of the two. Now, are they successful in strengthening this identity? Time will tell. And we should not be a judge on whether or not they're going to be successful. Every society goes through this process, and there are no exception. But it's too soon to know this. It reminds me of something attributed to the late Mahatma Gandhi when he was asked what he thought about Western civilization. And he thought it would be a very good idea. It would be a very good idea. Give you another example. That one is too profound. When President Richard Nixon and Zhou Enlai, the former prime minister of China, got together, they were talking about the French Revolution that occurred in 1789. I'm sure some of you have heard the story. And Nixon asked Zhou Enlai what he thought of the French Revolution that occurred in 1789. This conversation is taking place in 1972. And Zhou Enlai apparently replied, "It's too soon to know." It's too soon to know. So we have to wait a few years to figure this out, of this identity business. You know, as I mentioned France as an example. France as it is today, as a country, the Capitan era, if you would like, has been together only for 1,000 years. Before then, it was all a bunch of clans. The following kingdom, the kingdom of Navarre, the kingdom of Bordeaux, the kingdom of whatever, you know, all the different eras. The Capitan era came and united all the French Republic. That's only 1,000 years old. It's very recent. 1,000 years is nothing in history. Trust me, it's nothing in history. So you have to be patient. But your more difficult question is the comparison morality with Iran. I'm not an expert on Iran, even though I did my doctoral studies with a Persian, with an Iranian American, Ruhollah Ramazani at UVA, at the University of Virginia. And I love Iranian food. That's about it. You know, not much of Iran is very attractive to me. And their morality, especially under the Islamic Republic, has been pretty awful. It's been pretty awful. I mean, how can you justify legally prostitution? Morally, it's justified. Zawaj mut'a. You can have a marriage in Shia Islam for a few hours. I'm sorry, that's prostitution. In Sunni Islam, that's a no-no. You don't do that. I mean, there are certain, you can have zawaj misyar, but that's more than a few hours. You have to have, you know, you have to wait a period of time to find out whether there is a pregnancy involved. It's an elaborate system. It's not as simple. The Iranian morality, we've seen what happened in the revolution. Iran hangs every year or kills every year over 1,000 people for various morality crime. We saw what happened to the young woman that was not wearing a chador, a veil on her face, and she was murdered. She was murdered. And you will not see that in Saudi Arabia. That's kind of the morality that we're talking about here is mild compared to what we see in Iran. The immoral interpretations. In the old days, it was not about the dress code. Really, everybody talks about the dress code, the hijab, the niqab, and so on. That was not about it. It was about ikhtilat, where you had pre-married sex, essentially. That was frowned upon. That a relationship between a man and a woman, or between a man and a man and a woman and a woman, because it happens like in every society, that was frowned upon. That was what they were talking about. That was what they wanted to ban. Now, the codification has become simplified. They're talking about dress code. They're talking about private behavior. You know, you can go out in restaurants and you see couples, unmarried couples, having lunch together. Nobody bothers anybody anymore. That's not the morality level that we're talking about. In Iran, it's still a no-no. So I will defer to your better judgment on this. I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I'm saying you cannot make the comparison. It doesn't compare. Now, the decency code, and the lady in the back asked me about the places of worship for many, and the code that the Prophet himself ruled. The Prophet had long hair and all that. You know, over the years, even though Islamic law has been applied, there are also traditions. There are also local traditions. Islam was revealed in the desert of Arabia. where there were people, tribes, clans. They had their own moral codes. Before Islam, it doesn't mean that the local people had no morality. Of course they had moral codes. They had to live with each other. Mankind has had moral codes since Adam and Eve. This has nothing new. There were codes all the time. But over the time period, traditions were added, interpretations were added. Islam is a very modernizing society, actually, when you think about it. But the traditions have kept everything behind. By the way, the argument that you presented, that's precisely the argument that Mohammed bin Salman presents. That's exactly what he says. He says we're going back to our own roots. We're going to the Islamic rules and traditions. And what we're going to get rid of are all these add-ons that have been smacked on us all these years. We want to get rid of them. And more importantly, we're not going to allow individual imams, individual sheikhs to make up the rules as they go along. We want to have a code system. The decency code's beauty is that it is a code. That's the beauty of it. It's written. I will talk more about that on Thursday when I talk about the legal code itself. And I will give you an idea with the numbers. I have the numbers. How many codes have been published? How many precedents now have been published? Now they're publishing things. So that's the key issue. And whether or not your question about one day there will be places of worship for non-Muslims in the land of Arabia, that's a very important question. In UAE, in Oman, in Qatar, in Kuwait, and in Bahrain, there are churches and there are Shinto temples and there are Buddhist temples and there are a variety of non-Muslim temples. Not in Saudi Arabia. So far, there aren't none. But I'm going to give you an interesting hint as to what might happen in the future. Was it 3 years ago, I think, either 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I'm not sure, the Maronite patriarch in Lebanon, who's a cardinal in the Roman Church, Cardinal Al-Ra'i, went on a visit to Saudi Arabia. And he was welcomed by the king and the heir apparent and everybody. And he was given the keys of a church near Mecca, not far from Mecca, an old church that is now in ruins. He says, we are giving you this church. You fix it. You rebuild it. He didn't say you can worship there. He said, we're giving you this as a gift. We're returning this to you as a gift. In Mecca and Medina, before Islam, there were Jewish and Christian temples and churches. Now, whether or not this will happen in the future, we will see. The way things are going, it's positive news that in fact Islam is so strong, it is powerful enough to tolerate the presence of other religions around. But this will take time because in older generation, young people are much more open to this, but in older generation it's difficult for them to accept a non-Muslim presence on the Arabian Peninsula. You know, that's the way it is.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes. Okay.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for your lecture. As you said that decency code does not refer to Sharia. And as well as on the other side, Mohammed bin Salman says that Quran is the constitution. And we know that Quran enforces women to cover their hair. And decency code does not has any provisions that one women should cover their hair. And so don't you think it's contradictory? And in my view, what I think is that westernized countries might be getting influence from this decision, and they are banning their hijab in their countries. So what are your views on that? And the second part is that as we are diversifying in Saudi Arabia, what are your views on LGBTQ reforms?
Thank you, sir. I'm Surya Prakash Nautiyal, PhD student at Center of West Asian Studies. Sir, previously in 1990s, we have saw that when the foreign troops landed in Saudi Arabia, so there was a resistance from the religious authority. So, sir, when you are explaining these reforms, these developments, so now how religious authority is, acting in these, acting to these reforms, and how, what will be the, balance of power? There is, previously there is a balance of political power and religious authority. There is a balance between them, but now what will happen to this combination? Thank you.
Hello, sir. Thank you for your lecture. I'm Shazia Askar, master's second year student in PISM JNU. My question is that as Mohammed bin Salman has been softening the role of Islam and Islamic institution in the governance of Saudi Arabia, but the thing is, in Islamic countries, political governance has to be in consonance with the religion, right? So as he has been softening, won't it impact the religious identity of Saudi Arabia? As you said, ki from God's will, we are moving from God's will to state's will, or that's like separation of church from the state. So what's your view on that? How he is going to dilute the impact of religion on the state? Thank you.
Sir, one question. Okay.
Thank you for your lecture. Sir, you were discussing policies and like a top-down approach from the government to the society. But for these policies to be actually successful, the citizenry has to be on the same page with the government. We have seen in, I think Anuradha also talked about Iran, where the Pahlavi dynasty banned the veil, and after 40 years it was there was a revolution, and there was also pent up anger amongst the conservatives. And what Saudi Arabia is doing, there are economic reforms which is also, they're altering the rentier bargain with the citizens, and they're also making changes in the way society perceives religion. So where are the citizens? Like what do they think of this, and are they on the same page with the government?
The Quran is the constitution of Saudi Arabia. I have read the Quran from top to bottom. I have read the Bible as well as the Bhagavad Gita and all of them. There is nothing in the Quran that says a woman has to cover their hair. Nothing. It says you have to wear decent clothes. And by the way, not just for women, for men too. Both men and women have to wear decent clothes. There is nothing about covering the hair. Nothing. These are traditions that have been added over time. And the hijab has never been banned. In fact, in the pre-1979 period, the shawls that you have, for example, on you, you're wearing the shawl that cover your hair. Usually the shawl was, in proper society, the shawl was put over one's hand. It was a sign of respect, that some dignity. They didn't cover their hair with it. They carried it with them, unless there was something exceptional that they were seeing, and then they covered themselves. But it was the code, the dress code that was introduced had nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with religious requirements. It was part of tradition. And after 1979, because of what Juhayman Otaibi has done and his cohorts, things have changed dramatically. The movie theaters were shut down. Men and women were separated. All these schools were segregated. The beaches were all closed for women. They couldn't go to the beach and so on and so forth. You asked me about the LGBTQ community. Like in every society, there are homosexuals in Saudi Arabia too. It would be illogical to assume that they are not. They're human beings. Human beings have sexual needs one way or the other. But obviously, it is illegal in the country. There is a codification. Now, we're talking about women's issues. In the second part of this discussion, I will talk about, but since you asked the question, I will answer it now. Let me give you an example of one of the strict rules of Islam, which is not just true in Islam, it is also true in a lot of other religions, Christianity and others. For example, abortion is illegal, right? Well, in Islam, abortion is a crime, but so is in Christianity, even though a lot of Christian countries, they practice abortion. So therefore, you have the struggle, if you would like. This is a human struggle more than anything else. You have to come to terms with the social dynamics of societies. And what can be acceptable in one society might not be acceptable in another society. The behavior of certain codes, certain moral behavior can be codified in one society, they cannot be codified in another society. You go to China, for example, their codes and their rules and moral values are totally different. You go to Russia, totally different. Everybody has their own codes. So therefore, there are homosexuals in Saudi Arabia like there are in every other country in the world, but they are not in public. You will not find that in public. You will not see that, even though most, like in India, most men hold hands. I mean, when I hold Dr. Mudassir's hand, this is not a sexual relationship. This is a friendly relationship. But in the United States, this is perceived to be sexual. In America, if I were to hold his hand, people would think that I'm sexually involved with the man. You see what I'm saying? It all depends on the different society, in a different background, traditions, and so on and so forth. What applies to one doesn't apply to the other. Now, in terms of what happened to the religious leaders and the impact of the religious identity, this is actually the Friday presentation. You have to be patient until Friday. I have prepared, I will talk to you about Juhayman Utaybi in some detail, about the religious authorities, the mullahs and so on, and what kind of business they're in now, what are they doing to make a living. I will talk all about that on Friday. Be patient with me, unless you want not to come back on Friday. Now, final point here before we go to the next round. Are citizens on the same page as the rulers? Your question is very well taken. You know what? Yes, they are. The majority of Saudis today are in full agreement. They approve of what's going on for very, very simple reasons. Very simple reasons. That they feel free. For the first time in many, many decades, maybe centuries, they feel that they have a leader who is actually speaking for them, looking after their interests, putting their interests ahead of everything else. It doesn't mean that the monarchy has disappeared. No, it's a monarchy. And by definition, in a monarchy, there is only one person that rules. There is no representation in terms of parliament. There is a majlis, of course, but it's not elected. You don't have members, there are no political parties allowed, that kind of stuff. But the population, especially the young people, less than 30 years old of Saudi Arabia, they are very pro-Mohammed bin Salman. He's very popular. If you were to take a public opinion poll in Saudi Arabia today and ask whether they approved of Mohammed bin Salman, I would wager anything you want that he will score 99%, and it will not be fabricated, it will be real. Most people support him. There are people who oppose him, no question about that. There are people who don't like him. But in every society, there are people who don't like their leaders. It's very natural. Saudi Arabia is no exception. But most people are supporting him. Okay. Yes. So we'll take one more round.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, my question is related to the concept of sovereignty. It's just for the conceptual understanding that how can we address the question of sovereignty in the context of Saudi Arabia when we say concepts like, okay, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So when we say the concepts like morality is evolving, social dynamics are evolving, and you said that there, we can see a kind of ontological transition in the fundamental social dynamics where the morality or social dynamics, these systems are being subjected to the state's will. Earlier, they were maybe subjected to God's will. So how can we address the basic question of sovereignty in the context of Saudi Arabia first? And second, can we see or can we say that there is an introduction of the typical secular principles into the political system of the absolute monarchy? And if it is yes, then how can we see the political future related to these concepts of secularism and sovereignty? Thank you.
Hello, sir. My question is related to Mutawwa, the religious police in Saudi Arabia. As you said that the Mutawwa's influence in the Saudi society has been reduced, almost nullified. But I'm looking, as you said that most of the laws has been codified. So instead of the some social elements like Mutawwas or any committee, the state itself is making the same law as a codified. For example, a few months back, I think 6-8 months back, one of the tourists came in Saudi Arabia, and a man wearing ladies abaya, and he was just roaming in some mall in Riyadh, and was arrested by the Saudi police actually. And later he was apologized, and then he released actually. So how do you see this? I mean, the same thing is doing by the state as defined by the code. And the second thing, sir, I mostly read historian Madawi al-Rashid. He warned the Mohammed bin Salman in his modernization process that he might not read the history of Saudi, as you mentioned, Johaman al-Taibi, how he, I mean, what he did in 1979 in Makkah siege. So he warned that Mohammed bin Salman is not aware about that. He forcefully modernizing Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
He wants me to get in trouble. You know that I work in Saudi Arabia, right? Bless you. God bless you.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, Islam is a very important part of Saudi's foreign policy, and Saudi is also one of the principal contributor to OIC. So I just wanted to know all this, with all these reforms in Islam, how it changes when there is a battle of Khalif going on between Saudi, Iran and Turkey, how these reforms will change Saudi's position in the Islamic world, and how the neighboring Islamic countries are perceiving these changes. Are they also thinking of changing, or are they getting more radical? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kechichian. My question is related with the comparison with Iran, because what we see from the ring side view, Iran, Saudi Arabia, both claim legitimacy from Islam, and they actually competed for it in the mid-80s after 1979. A lot of the orthodoxy that has been placed in the social arena during the 1980s was the outcome of that particular pressure, that ideological pressure. So from the ringside view, it is natural that people who are not from both regions, they actually view who is the real representative of Islam, which actually is the legitimacy in their terms. Because especially there are a lot of things like reforms about the women's driving, and many these things are also people view that in Iran women are doing all those things. and also they own businesses and everything. So my view is that there will be a comparison. So, like for example, especially as you mentioned about the nikah muta during in Iran, there is one more thing. Saudi ulama actually allowed nikah misyar, that is a temporary marriage for people who actually visiting foreign countries, and some of the actually cases has been reported where they married in United States or in Europe, and they had son there or some offsprings there. So there are a lot of things that they are also doing. I mean, don't you think that this comparison is natural? Because there will be a comparison because both claim that we are the representative. Maybe Mohammed bin Salman is trying to reform, but yes, the youngsters are with him, more than 65%. But the older lot is still very much not in line with him. So my view is, my question is that, do you think that this comparison would ever end? Because I don't think so. It will end.
I will talk a lot more about the morality question when we talk about the religious folks. So bear with me until Friday, if you don't mind, because we don't have time to go through all the details. But I want to tie the two questions that were asked here about foreign policy, especially Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Sunni versus Shia. And Zawaj Mut'a and Zawaj Misyar are totally different things. You know, you should not compare the two. It's like apples and oranges. They're both fruit, but they're very different fruit. So therefore, one has to be careful about these things. In terms of the foreign policy, and it relates to your question about Iran and Saudi Arabia as well, the majority of world's Muslim are Sunni. 90% are Sunni. 10% are Shia. The difference is not dogmatic. The difference between Sunni and Shia Islam is not about the Quran. It's the same holy scriptures. There is no difference there. It's about power. It's about politics. The fact of the matter is that the Iranians want, as a minority, they want to rule over the Muslim world. They consider Mecca and Medina to be occupied territory by the Al Saud. Remember what Ayatollah Khomeini used to say about the Al Saud ruling family. They're apostates. Those are the words that he used. Kuffar. They are sinners. They are sinners, essentially. So we are talking about political dispute. And remember that Persians were converted to Islam. And not only they were converted to Islam, originally they were converted to Sunni Islam. It was not until the Qajar dynasty that they became Shia. And they became Shia precisely because they were against the political system in place. It was all political. It was not religious at all. Now, in terms of bringing this, tying it to foreign policy, obviously you're going to have conflict between the two. And Iran is a much bigger country, much more populated, very wealthy country, very capable country. It has a very rich history. Iran is a proud society. Iranians are a great people. There is no doubt about any of that. Almost 100 million people. Saudi Arabia is smaller, about 30 million people. Wealthy as well, but sparsely populated. It does not carry the kind of weight in the Gulf region that Iran does. But guess what? Saudi Arabia is also the leader of the Muslim Ummah. For the mere fact that Mecca and Medina are located in Saudi Arabia. Don't complain to me, go and complain to the Lord. That's the way it is. I had this conversation with an Iranian colleague of mine. I said to him one day, why are you complaining all the time? Go to the Lord and lodge a formal complaint. Why did you put Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia? You know, he could have put them in Mashhad or in Qum, for example. But that's the reality. And this competition in foreign policy is going to perpetuate for a long time to come. Now, hopefully, they are neighbors at the end of the day. They have to live next to each other. And they're both fellow Muslim countries. They have to get along. Will they get along? Well, it depends who rules. Sometimes they will get along, and sometimes they will not get along. I will stop here. Enough.
Thank you very much.
I will come back to your question.
Yes, I know there are lots of more questions, but we have 7 more lectures, and they are all interlinked. So please keep your questions and ask them as and when you get time. Can have, seamless interaction. The second lecture today is on a very, very pertinent issue related to, obviously, the transformations that Saudi Arabia is experiencing since 2015. But if you look at the history of Saudi Arabia in the last, 70, 80 years, and especially more so in the last 3, 4 decades, the issues of women, minorities, and migrants or refugees have occupied a lot of attention worldwide. And often Saudi Arabia is accused of not being just to these sections of the society, and more because of the structural and systematic challenges and issues that the society and the country, the kingdom faces. And how these issues are being tackled in today's Saudi Arabia is something which is very, very important. So, to speak to you on this, we again have Professor Kechichian. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. I want to talk a lot about migration because I know that in India this is a huge interest. And I want to talk about the different minorities' role in Saudi Arabia. But I want to conclude first on what we started at the beginning of this conversation on the role of women and how that is changing. And I left you a few moments ago talking about pseudo-secularization. It's not real yet, but pseudo-secularization. Let me tie the two parts together so that it becomes clearer for you. The code that I spoke about earlier has a secular language in it, and the sidelining of the committee that has now become a reality, one might be inclined to assume that was simply a part of the secularization trend that was no different from cases occurring in other modernizing states in the 20th century. However, even though the language of the law was largely secular, the underlying logic of the decency code was based on normative religious beliefs. For instance, wearing men's undergarments, the sirwal and the fanilla, white pants and t-shirt, without the thobe, that is, when a man wears the undergarments without the thobe on top, which is the national dress, mostly white in color, this was prohibited by the committee in 2013. In other words, a man could not just wear his underwear, pants and shirt, and be in public. This was forbidden because it was held that this form of dress was appealing or seductive and could lead to fitna, which is chaos. Fitna, F-I-T-N-A-H. You hear this term all the time, fitna. Everything could be fitna. Everything that is against religion could be fitna. And you want to stay away from chaos. Apparently chaos is not good unless you are in a James Bond movie, then chaos becomes a very important part of your life. Remember that James Bond always had to fight against chaos, that very fantastic organization that ruled the other world, essentially, the other world. Now, of course, this same form of attire is penalized under the new code as well, because it is considered to be uncivilized and aesthetically unappealing and offends public taste. Those three sentences are from the code now. In other words, the clothes that you're wearing now must not be uncivilized, must not be aesthetically unappealing, and must not offend public taste. It was relevant to note that those who wear undergarments or sleepwear in public places were normally members of the lower classes, which suggested that seemingly secular justifications were used to exclude those individuals from society. Similarly, shorts worn, again, by men mostly, are banned in Saudi Arabia, in public places. You can wear a short at home or on the beach, but you cannot walk around with a short in Saudi Arabia. The reasoning behind this stems from the Islamic obligation to cover intimate parts of a man's body, or the aura, which is the part of the body from the navel to below the knees. Remarkably, and while the language of the law was secular, its logic remained religious, which is your question in the back. I am referring to, even though they are using secular language, they're still applying religious principles and they're not deviating from it. Similarly, even though the code did not provide any details on the specifics of a woman's dress wear, in his first interview with a foreign television network after he became heir apparent in 2017, Prince Mohammed bin Salman referenced women's code in Saudi Arabia as an example of outdated interpretations on the laws of Sharia. Let me repeat that. Outdated interpretations of Islamic norms according to the laws of Sharia. He said, the laws are very clear and stipulated in Sharia that women must wear decent, respective clothing like men. This, however, he is continuing, does not particularly specify a black abaya or a black head cover. There is no such thing in the scriptures or in Sharia about black color. In fact, the color that you are wearing and the color that the ladies are wearing in the back is very common now in Saudi Arabia. Women are wearing different colors abayas, different colors hijabs, and so on and so forth. But he said, he concluded, said there must be of decent, the decision, he continued, the decision is entirely left for women to decide what type of decent and respectful attire they choose to wear. It's up to women now to decide what is decent. If a woman wants to wear a hijab, she's free to wear the hijab because she's decided that that's decent. If another woman decides that she does not want to wear the hijab because that's decent for her, then she doesn't have to wear the hijab. Now, you cannot be clearer than that there is a level of freedom that has been introduced, giving the women the right to decide what they consider to be decent. Obviously, nobody is talking about walking down the street in a bikini. That's not going to happen. But nevertheless, you understand what the mentality is changing now. And women's roles in Saudi Arabia have totally changed now. Is the code then a return to religious policing by other means? That's a fair question to ask. And is the state using women? That's a very important question to ask. Is the state now using women? Sometimes you take 2 steps forward and take 1 step backwards. That doesn't mean that you are changing social norms. The codes that are being implied, and I will talk a lot more about this on Friday when I talk about the religious establishment. The codes are essentially, are you ready for this? Given responsibility to citizens. That you are parts of this culture, of this society. You make decisions. We don't make all the decisions. You participate in the decision-making process. Now, of course, there are, as I've said, earlier, there are economic reasons for doing this. And let's be realistic. Saudi Arabia has a huge population. I will talk about that in 1 second here. And the demographic reality being what it is, you need people to work. In fact, when you go to Saudi Arabia today to do any kind of work, you'll find that half of the individuals with whom you are dealing are women. And they're much more efficient, by the way, than the men. Saudi women are a lot more efficient than Saudi men. I prefer to work with Saudi women than to work with Saudi men. I would not say this at the center, even though this is being videotaped now. And I don't know, somebody is going to watch it and they're going to send me a written note, reprimand. I don't care. That's all right. I'm too old to be reprimanded, so it's all right. But it's much easier to work with women now because they want to participate in the system. They put their heart and soul in whatever it is that they are doing. But the demographic realities are also there for people to see. Saudi Arabia, the kingdom itself, has the largest in 2000. The last statistics that are available is for 2022, unfortunately. 23 and 24 are still not out. But the official statistics say that Saudi Arabia has the fourth largest Arab country. It has 32 million plus people. And 41% of these are migrants. 41% of people who live in Saudi Arabia are migrant workers, which means about 13.5 million out of the 34 are foreign workers, migrant workers. I use the word migrant or expatriate workers or foreign workers. They're all the same. They're not Saudi citizens. They are outsiders, people like me who work in Saudi Arabia. I'm considered to be a migrant because I work there. I make my living there. A lot of people, a lot of Indians, I will give you the numbers now in a second. So therefore, you have a demographic issue here. When you have a country that has 13.5 million foreign workers to run the economy, that tells you that the economy cannot do without these individuals. Otherwise, it will not function, right? Now, these are significant figures as the country has experienced a population explosion during the past 40 years. The growth rate for Saudi Arabia is 1.62%. And it's supposed to continue for the foreseeable future. Incidentally, 1.62 is pretty high. That I don't know how much it averages, but it averages to about five or six children per woman. So it's pretty high. It went down. At one point, it used to be eight children per woman. Now it's down to 5, and it's going further down as we go along. As the country develops more and more, the natural growth of the population tends to grow. But the current projections that are anticipated for a large population increase that will reach maybe between 50 and 60 million people by 2030. In other words, it will double between now and the next decade. The population is expected to double. Not all of them citizens. Many of them will be foreign workers, of whom, as I said, right now you have 13 million expats. That number could go as high as 25 to 30 million expats. That's huge. That's almost half of the population that will remain as a foreign population. Now, when, for example, in 2022, they were forming at the NEOM project, the famous The Line project, whereby they're going to put a whole bunch of people in a very limited area north of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman predicted that the capital city alone could accommodate 25 million by 2030. You guys think you have traffic problems in Delhi. You should see the traffic problems in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, even though now they have 6 metro lines that just opened, and it's helping a good deal. But nevertheless, traffic is bad, and you don't want to be caught in a traffic jam in Riyadh or in Jeddah, because in order to get to your destination, you need 2.5 hours to get there. So obviously, the phases you're going to see at the line, they were going to put 1.5 million people. Now they are scaling that back. Maybe they will start with 100,000 people. At any rate, by 2030, the Saudi population will probably almost be 40 million people. That's a lot. By 2050, the kingdom's crude birth rate per 1,000 persons would be 10.8 natalities per annum. That is, for every 1,000 persons, there will be 10 births every year. That's huge. And this number is going to continue for the foreseeable future. What does this mean? All of these figures confirm that the Saudi population would reach unprecedented levels with two significant consequences. One, there will remain a huge expatriate presence for the foreseeable future well into 2050, perhaps beyond. Second, that these substantial population increases would have direct impacts on the kingdom's urban environments that will in turn necessitate updated infrastructure at every imaginable level: water, garbage, sewer system, roads. You think about all the things that are involved in population growth. Moreover, and given the fact that the majority of residents may well be relatively young, the changing demographic scenes could impede fresh socio-economic, perhaps even political requirements that will significantly drain available resources. Among these, one can think of basic necessities like food, water, housing, education, transportation. Now, how Riyadh manages these two major challenges would largely determine whether Vision 2030, which we will talk about tomorrow with the economic changes, whether or not they will be successfully implemented. I mean, you can have all the projects in the world. Fine, they look perfect on paper. But when it comes to implementing them, human beings are going to implement them. And you're going to have to provide for these human beings. You're going to have to provide not just the infrastructure, you have to provide the opportunities for them to implement all these mega projects. You cannot have an entire city built without roads, without water, without sewer systems. It's very complicated. Those of you who are looking at urban studies realize how impossible it is to actually create brand cities with all the services that are required. How Saudi authorities tackled a far more sophisticated migrant presence in the kingdom compared to past practices, of course, and in the process maintain a demographic balance at home between locals and foreigners. This is called the Saudiization process. That is, there are certain jobs that are forbidden for foreigners to work in. Only local Saudis are allowed to work. For example, taxi drivers in Saudi Arabia, not private, but public taxi drivers must be Saudi. A foreigner cannot be a taxi driver. He can be a taxi driver illegally, but if he is caught, he is deported. For example, women's lingerie shops, you have to be Saudi women working there. No foreigners allowed. There are certain categories of all these different job levels, Saudization. But on the other hand, if you want to boom the economy, you need foreign workers to come, not just to build the infrastructure, but to run the factories that you want, to run the hotels, to run all the facilities. And more important than this, you have to ask yourself, if you're educating the population as much as possible, will the normal Saudi accept to work for the same wages as an expatriate worker who is much more willing to work for smaller salaries? That creates a dilemma as well. Again, the permutations are too many to think about why this balance needs to be found between citizen population and expatriate population. It gets more complicated. Now, to better answer some of these questions, I think it's fair to ask what are the implications of these significant demographic transportations on Saudi society, and how can the government address them? Ultimately, I think it will be useful to examine the role of recent demographic changes and their impact on the labor markets at two levels. One, to examine the number of Saudis who enter the labor force every year. And second, to assess the number of non-Saudis whose services may be required, may be essential for the various Vision 2030 objectives. Now, let's look at the demographic realities. In 2000, as I said, the numbers you already know. the population chart is going to increase. The percentage of able-bodied Saudis between the ages of 20 and 60 in 2024 was 41%, and 22% for females in the workforce. Only 22% of Saudi women between the ages of 20 and 60 are working outside of the house today. The rest are working at home. 41% of Saudi males between the ages of 20 and 60 are working outside of the home. That means 60% are not working, or they are doing some other things. Those are significant numbers, and it's for this reason why you have migration at such an important level, and why you have to have all these numbers. I'm going to give you some examples as well. Even if over the next period the number of women increases in the workforce from 21%, it goes up, 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 and up. Even if there is a steady growth, in practical terms, you need more expatriate workers, because the 13.4 million, 13.5 million expatriate workers today, many of whom have family members with them. The kingdom has a tradition of hospitality and welcoming a majority of these men and women. They've played a critical role in the labor force. In fact, in the post-1974 oil boom economy, Saudi Arabia attracted very large numbers of foreign workers from a variety of countries around the world. Lest we overlook this fundamental point, it's important to remember that migration patterns on the Arabian Peninsula are very old. They've developed prior to Islam, and of course spread with Islam. And in the 20th century, after the oil boom of the 1970s, played critical roles in assisting the founder monarch with his manpower needs. He needed manpower to build Saudi Arabia, a desert society. As the kingdom invested in developing human resources, it organized its economic policies, it embarked on 5-year plans that King Faisal started. Every 5 years there is a 5-year plan to equip the country with core infrastructure facilities and the diversified post-oil boom visions starting in the mid-1970s. They encourage both skilled and semi-skilled workers to enter Saudi Arabia to fill a plethora of needs. A steady flow of migrant workers headed to the kingdom. They transformed into a top recipient foreign population. And in 2022, those are the numbers, there are 2 countries that are ahead of Saudi Arabia in terms of international migration. The United States and Germany only. There are more migrants that go to the United States and Germany and then Saudi Arabia. The majority of Saudi Arabia's foreign-born population are males between the ages of 25 and 45, and they contribute to the labor markets. I will give you some numbers here. Are you ready? Are you paying attention? 2.5 million Indians, 1.5 million Pakistanis, 1 million Bangladeshis, 1 million Egyptian. Now, this is not small number. These are not small numbers. These are significant numbers. And I'm only talking about Saudi Arabia. If you put the other Gulf countries together, you begin to appreciate the number of foreign workers. There must be at least 10 to 15 million Indians working throughout the Gulf region. So that's a significant number. In fact, although the hundreds of thousands of skilled Indian, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Egyptians, they told an important sector. In the old days, most of these were unskilled laborers. Now, semi-skilled and skilled laborers as well. You have lots of physicians, for example, that practice in the Gulf region. Indian doctors who are practicing medicine in Saudi Arabia. This is now common. It's not uncommon anymore. In the old days, you didn't see this. Now you're seeing it. It's evolving. Many migrants toiling in the kingdom, they endured very different, difficult living conditions, and working conditions tend to be pretty harsh for them, especially in the non-skilled and semi-skilled workers. Their life is tough, and the opportunities are not very good, but obviously, the more skilled you are, the better off you are. While a large number of migrants live and work in Saudi Arabia, during COVID-19, a good number of them left the kingdom. The numbers are available, but they are probably doctored. Well, nobody knows the exact numbers. Official numbers, and you will see in a second, official numbers don't match the reality. The census figures are not really the most accurate figures. They tell you that they are the most accurate, but I will explain to you why it's not accurate, so that you know. This is an important point. I will stop here and explain this. This is very important. Saudi Arabia also has a significant illegal population. People who go in for Hajj or Umrah, and they never leave. They stay. Therefore, you have a pool, an undetermined number of people from all over the place. They could be from Uganda, they could be from Uzbekistan, they could be from India, they could be from Pakistan, they could be from any number of countries. Good Muslims who go on Hajj and Umrah and decide that we're staying here. We're better off here than we are back home. This is an illegal population. Now, once in a while, the government has these policies where they forgive and forget. Essentially, they ask you to please prepare your bags, we'll pay your way, you return home. But more often than not, this is overlooked. Why? Because it provides very cheap labor. And cheap labor exists for a purpose. It makes the wealthy wealthier. I always tell my better half to always remember that the wealthy become wealthy with the monies of the poor people, with the labor of the poor people. That's the reality, that's mankind. We have still to evolve from that level. Give it 8,888 years. It will coat. It will take a while, but we're not there yet. Human beings, this is a good experiment that God is playing with us, but the plan is not finished yet. We need more time to become really human and respect each other. So cheap labor exists in Saudi Arabia as well. Illegal labor exists in Saudi Arabia as well. That's why the numbers don't match. The Census Bureau, obviously an illegal worker is not going to go and say, well, I'm here, I'm illegal, write me down. They're not going to do that, obviously. So therefore, there is a shadow population that exists in that society whose numbers we don't know. A colleague of mine, Fahad al-Sharif, and I wrote a book 2 years ago, an edited book, the two of us worked together, called Sacred Duty. It's about migration policy in the Gulf. And why migration is such an important issue for Saudi Arabia. If you're interested, you can access it online. You can see it. Maybe the library has a copy of it here. You can read all the details. And we actually use Quranic statements saying how Islam encourages you to be tolerant of migrant workers, of workers in general, respect labor, and so on and so forth. Whether or not this is applied is something totally different, of course, but the rules are there for people to apply them. I close the bracket. Now, as I've said, the census in 2022, I told you there were 2.5 million Indians working in Saudi Arabia. According to the census, that number is only 1.8. That's a significant gap between 2.5 and 1.8. Same for Pakistanis, Yemenis, Egyptians, etc. down the line. I'll give you another example. The census figure says that Indonesia has 175,000 migrants in the country, whereas the Indonesian General Authority for Statistics database, if you look at the numbers in Indonesia, their figure is 1.5 million. Now, there is a difference between 175,000 migrants and 1.5 million. Now, which one is correct? Which one do you believe? Now, of course, if you look at the census, 2022 census, again, the last data available, for Lebanese expatriates in Saudi Arabia, it stands at 53,000. 53,000 are traveling every day. The actual figure is probably close to 500,000 with their families and so on and so forth. Where did these numbers come from? From business leaders, business community leaders, people who hire Lebanese hoteliers, chefs in restaurants, experts, accountants. Lebanese accountants are big. The most famous Lebanese accountant was Rafiq Hariri, who became prime minister, who went to Saudi Arabia as an accountant years ago. He worked there, he succeeded, he got into business, he got to know the princes, he started building all these palaces and hotels. He became very famous, and he even got the nationality. But he started as an accountant. People forget that. And he became very successful. Good for him. Of course, he was assassinated. Not good for him, but poor guy. He was blown into smithereens. Hezbollah and the Iranians made sure that he was don't get me started. Anyway, so you get the idea of all these things. Now, I'm going to skip over the education system because I don't want to bore you with all these details about education. Then I want to talk about future labor needs because migration is very much tied to future labor needs. Beyond the vocational education, 80% of the Saudi population today lives in urban settings, a figure that's expected to even exceed the staggering figure of 97% by 2030. Only 3% of Saudis by 2030 will be rural population. Everybody will be urbanized. That's a tragedy in its own making, a real tragedy. Future labor requirements, therefore, are entirely different criteria. Acute urbanization means that Saudi society would be far less engaged in agriculture, which would raise its own set of very serious concerns because you become food dependent on imports, manufactured goods. All of it will be imported, would require transportation, distribution, labor skills. Will full-time employment be ensured in urban settings? Will Saudis work as transportation lorries, for example? Will they drive trucks to bring the food from the harbor to the different, distribute them? Or will that be occupied by Bangladeshi workers, for example? Those are the kind of things to think about. And if you're not relying on agriculture, we're going to have to import food. In fact, the Saudi Ministry of Agriculture and the other Gulf countries do the same thing, by the way. The Kuwaitis and the Emiratis do the same thing. They buy plots of land in different countries, including in India. They buy plots of land in Sudan, for example. Sudan, in Africa, Sudan is a very interesting case. It is probably the breadbasket of Africa. It has the richest soil in Africa. But it's a country that is mired in civil war. And it's now divided, of course. There are two Sudans now, South Sudan and the Sudan. And there is a civil war going on as well in the Sudan, on top of poverty, on top of labor problems, as if they needed to kill each other more. They're now at each other for very political reasons, nothing else. So therefore, Saudi Arabia, the Minister of Agriculture, they go and buy land, they buy water resources, they buy all these facilities in order to ensure food security in the next few decades that are coming. Because guess what? When you have to import food, you become dependent. And you have to pay the price that is asked. You cannot bargain, you cannot negotiate. If you want to buy Norwegian salmon, incidentally, Saudi Arabia is now producing salmon. But if you want to buy Norwegian salmon, you have to bring it from Norway, and you have to pay what the Norwegian government asks you the price to be. So you cannot bargain on that. You don't want to be dependent on food. Yes, was it, you were not present, but we were talking earlier at the lecture on Donald Trump. Donald Trump does not like Canadian milk. He does not want to import Canadian milk. He says that American milk is better. Our cows are better than your cows. So therefore, we want our own milk. But this is the same thing when you think about it in a country like Saudi Arabia. You become dependent on foreign food and you cannot pick. If you don't produce your own food, you have to bring it from somebody else because the population needs to eat. And you have to pay the price for that. And the price for that, when oil resources will go down and the subsidies are removed, will be very high. In other words, labor issues are probably some of the most difficult issues that the Saudi government will face in the next generation. They will face very serious challenges. Let me give you some examples as well in terms of labor and unemployment. Now, as I said, it's a question as to whether or not a Saudi will work in the transportation field, whether he will be happy to work as a truck driver. Let's say, I'm using that as a truck driver. Chances are that the Saudi will not be willing to be a truck driver, but he may have no choice but to drive that truck driver. Well, not all the Saudis are working. Unemployment is relatively high in most cities. It ranges between 8 and 23% in some regions. For Saudis, this is another challenge to overcome. In 2020, the last year for which these statistics were available, 7% unemployment stood at 7% in Najran, 7-8% in the Eastern Province, 9.4% in Mecca, 12% in Qasim, 14% in Riyadh, 14% in Hale, 15% in Baha, 15% in Asir, 15% in Tabuk, 18% in Jizan, 20% in Medina, 23% in the northern borders, and 27% in Juf. That's catastrophe. That's catastrophe. You have such unemployment among, these statistics are for able-bodied men and women between the ages of 20 and 60, always, always. Labor is 20-60, bear that in mind. With such high numbers, compare that, for example, with unemployment in the United States right now, which is less than 4%. In France, it's 8%, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know how it is in India, how much it is here, unemployment, but it's probably not very high. But you can check it on Google, find out what the World Wide Web tells us. Unemployment is a real problem. You have to deal with the fact that you have to have regional employment for all these folks that need to have something to do in their lives. And the government has all these projects. Mohammed bin Salman, yesterday I told you, wants to have 3 million Saudis working in tourism in order to welcome 100 million annual visitors. He wants 3 million people, Saudis, 3 million men and women, to work in tourism. Now, if you go to Riyadh next time, what's the unemployment?
6.4. 6.4.
6.4. 6.4, which is relatively low. Which is relatively low compared to 20% and 25% that we're talking about. So, obviously, and I want to give you an example of a very important challenge for unemployment and migration worker. Why Saudi Arabia needs all these migrant workers. If you want to put 3 million people in working in the tourism section, you got to train them, first of all. Tourism is a big thing now. Those of you who have been to Riyadh recently or would like to go to Riyadh, one of the places that you want to visit is the whole Dir'iyah complex, which is a city outside of Riyadh, the original capital of Saudi Arabia, of the Al Saud. Dir'iyah now is an open museum, open-air museum. They're restoring all the old palaces. They've built hotels. There is a Formula E circuit around. It's going to be a future tourism attractive place. So they're encouraging a lot of young people. For example, the guides at the Riyadh Palace, which is the old palace of the first and second monarchies. So they're restoring those old palaces. You want 3 million people, you need to train them. But is that enough? Is that enough? Is tourism the panacea that everybody is expecting? Or do you need to have factories? You need to have productive systems? You know, unfortunately, when you go outside in Delhi or in any Indian city, you have all these motorcycles. They're dangerous to drive around. I don't know how people drive here with all these motorcyclists around. You don't find that many motorcycles in Saudi Arabia. You don't find many people on bicycles either. But I will give you an insight that will shock you. There is not a single Arab country that produces a single bicycle. Not one. It's all imported. Arabs don't do bicycle. They don't do bicycle. Why can't we produce bicycles? Why do we have to import bicycles from China? Along with everything else. Why? I'm just using that as a silly example, but it awakens you to the kind of problems that one faces. Okay, at NEOM, you want to have lots of beautiful hotels, nice luxury hotels with yachts in the marina, and you're gonna cater to a certain level of Western tourists. All of that is fine. All of that is wonderful. But is that enough? Is that how the economy works? With luxury items for a small percent of the population? Can the Saudis afford to live in a $3 million home? Can they afford to have a yacht? Can every Saudi afford that? The answer is no. Some can, but the majority will not be able to. So you have to provide what I'm getting at. I'm sure you already guessed it. Vision 2030, about which I will say a lot more tomorrow, and the labor issue that I'm discussing right now, why does it need migrant workers? Is because you need to provide jobs for the middle class. You need to create a middle class. A society without a middle class cannot function. A society without a middle class cannot prosper. It's the middle class that makes a society run. And labor is a very, especially intensive labor, where you have to build things in a factory. Let me give you an example to make it even clearer. If, for example, you want to trim a tree, okay, there are lots of trees that need to be trimmed. So you need to have an electric saw. You can do with a regular saw, but it's easier to use an electric saw. Well, guess what? The electric saw must be built. It does not come from heaven. Okay? So a factory needs to build this electric saw. Let's say the example of the German company Stihl, S-T-I-H-L. They are very famous for these kinds of machine tools, right? So the steel company builds all these tools. They have factories in China, they have factories in Germany, they have factories in the United States, they're all over the place. Why can't Saudi Arabia build electric saws? What prevents them from doing that? They don't have the skill, they don't have the knowledge? No, they do have the skill, they have the knowledge, they can do the same things as well. You get the idea of the kind of labor challenges ahead. You need to have not just tourism. Tourism is important, it will play an important role, but you need to have a lot more if you want Vision 2030 to be implemented. And Vision 20, again, more about this tomorrow. Now, it's important to keep in mind, I want to talk about one other subject before we stop today. And this will take me a little while because I want to go in some detail. I spoke about labor, but now I'm going to talk about another need of, in addition to labor and food shortages, I want to talk about water. Water conditions in the kingdom, which, as I'm sure you know, experiences very little rainfall. Saudi Arabia does not have any rivers, no rivers whatsoever. And the rain-fed water cycle, there's very little of it, 90 cubic meters per capita per annum, which is nothing. You need a minimum of 90 cubic meters of water per year per person to live. You need 90 cubic meters of water as a minimum for every human being to wash, to clean, for hygiene purposes, for food preparation, you need 90 cubic meters of water per person per year. That's the minimum you need. Every person on this planet needs that. Most people don't get that. Most people don't get 90 cubic meters. Well, now these figures are below global average, and obviously the amounts that could not sustain rivers or lakes, which are needed to fulfill Vision 20's projects. It's important to bear in mind that the considerable proportion of the limited quantities of rain that were lost in flash floods to the sea, precipitation failed to replenish subterranean aquifers, the all-important water-carrying rock formation that fed springs and wells. So therefore, Saudi Arabia has a critical shortfall of water. It has developed, mistakenly, it was a big error in agriculture sector after the mid-1970s oil boom that, in hindsight, was a double-edged sword. While investments in agriculture provided some food security, that way you didn't have to import them, but the excessive use of water drained the existing aquifers. Logically, these could not be replaced with ease. That created a different kind of insecurity. So you had the food, but now you didn't have any water. In 2015, farming across the kingdom consumed 14 million cubic meters of water, which was more than 3 times the combined amount consumed in the industrial section. Think about that. 14 million cubic meters in farming, 1.2 million cubic meters in the industrial section. Private homes used only 3 million cubic meters of water. Let me repeat these numbers so that you understand what that means. Farming in 2015 used 14 million cubic meters of water. Industrial sector used 1.2 million cubic meters of water. Private homes used 3 million cubic meters of water. The overall demand for water in the kingdom doubled between 1980 and 2010, and it's been growing ever faster ever since. Now, in the past, Riyadh relied on 4 main methods to balance its water deficit, which could stand it in a good stead even in the post-normal climate era, but there is no guarantee, there are no guarantees that these would be sufficient beyond 2030. Successive governments constructed 200 dams. They constructed 200 dams since the 1980s, which captured flash floods in reservoirs, feeding a network of irrigation conduits. This vital infrastructure remained in place, but needed updates. You need to keep up with this. Second, the authorities invested in fossil water, ancient, non-renewable reservoirs hidden deep in sedentary rock formations, even if drilling was very expensive and technically very challenging. Such project sifted the brackish liquid that emerged, often mixed with silty particles, which required technologically demanding filtering. In other words, you get the water, but it costs you an arm and a leg at the end of the day. Persistent efforts in this area raised supplies by over 2/3 in 2005. A third tactic in the Saudi water strategy is desalination. used primarily to provide water for domestic use in cities. Riyadh, for example, gets desalinated water in a pipeline that stretches over 460 kilometers from the shores of the Arabian Gulf. You notice I didn't call it the Persian Gulf. From the Arabian Gulf. It comes all the way to Riyadh. 460 kilometers. Another approach has been to become a champion of virtual water, which effectively meant leasing huge productive tracts in Africa and Southeast Asia to secure long-term procurement of imported staple foods, though fresh ideas were required to guarantee both food security as well as water availability. In every one of these instances, many more laborers were engaged in agriculture, in water management, in critical transportation, which were all necessary to fill the Project 2030. Will the Saudis do all of these jobs, or would expatriates take care of them? I mean, the farm, don't write this down on the paper, please. The farm may be owned by a Saudi, but the farmers that are working on that field are non-Saudi expatriates. And let me conclude. It's been a long day. Let me conclude. I want to talk about migrant workers as well, to bring it all together. The United Nations General Assembly adopted the International Convention on the Protection and the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families back in 1990. This was when they created the International Migrants Day label, and every effort was made to foster the rights of expatriate workers. As a host country with a significant international workforce, Saudi Arabia had devised a system called the kafala system. A kafil is the person who is responsible for you, sponsorship. Kafala is sponsorship, whereby a sponsorship system that granted employers considerable countervailing powers over the migrants. There were past abuses, including curtailments of the expatriates' rights to leave and re-enter the country whenever they wanted to, or resign for their jobs, or move to another employer, or even contemplate raising objections to employment conditions, all of which created negative aura around it. Mercifully now, there are new reforms in the kingdom, as well as the other Gulf countries. I'm focusing on Saudi Arabia, but what I'm saying applies to the other countries as well, which permanently replace the system in place. One of the most important new laws that were introduced in Riyadh replaced the kafala system with a contract-based mechanism that allowed and will henceforth permit most foreign workers to freely enter and exit the country, change employers a year after signing their first contract, and otherwise retain one's passport. Before, the employer took your passport and you were essentially a slave. That's illegal now. Nobody can take your passport away from you. This reform effectively meant that the human rights of expatriate workers in the kingdom were, for the first time, protected. Consequently, the Saudi economy was no longer burdened with the kind of handicap that prevented labor productivity from rising. Few, however, should be surprised by the dramatic enhancements in labor relations, as mobility and appropriate legislative changes will inevitably buttress the country's labor strategy. One may well anticipate disruptions, though improved productivity will also translate into concrete economic benefits across the board. Stable and higher wages will prevail in the future, despite serious environmental challenges that will be created. And I gave you the example of water, but you can duplicate that with a lot of different sectors. Businesses would be emboldened to accept financial risks as they allocate capital investments because, and I would like to emphasize this some more, they would likely benefit from positive signs of productivity. If your migrant worker is happy and you're treating him nicely, he will be more productive. He will not slack off. He will work. Over time, even the significant wage gap between Saudis and non-Saudis would be gradually closing, something that would also benefit the Saudi worker. Now, maybe it is too soon to appraise Saudi Arabia's demographic transformation. Positive signs, however, are clear, both for domestic and migrant workers. 3 points. 1, introduce relatively stable demographic conditions in the country. This is a must. Huge population increases reaching 60 million by 2050 or 2060 are dangerous. Population growth is not something that people should brag about, because the more people you have, the more you have to take care of them. And you have to create the environment for people to create wealth and become wealthy. It's easier said than done, trust me. Second, ensure balanced labor collaboration between Saudis and expatriate workers. Long are gone the days when expatriate workers can be pushed around. There are people who are still pushed around, no doubt about that. But increasingly, as the professionalism increases, people are becoming a lot more responsive, that you have to treat the worker with the kind of respect that that person deserves. And third and finally, meet most if not all of Vision 2030's objectives. It's just a matter of time before you come to terms with the challenges of demographics, with the challenges of migration workers. There is no escaping the fact that minorities will be there, population changes will be there. For the foreseeable future, Saudi Arabia will have to live with the fact that almost half of its population will be non-Saudi. I'll stop.
It's a shocking statement.
Thank you.
Thank you,
He's
Sir
taking all
Kechichian.
these notes, but
Again,
you're not gonna write
you have
all of this
raised-
down in Arab news, are you? Remember, I have to go back there.
I think despite the long day you had today, and despite, the 2 consecutive lectures, I think you have raised the appetite for more questions. So, yes. Okay. So, Irfan, Deepika, Stuti, and then Aslam.
Speak close to the mic.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. I have 2 questions. First is on where does the foreign workers figure in the Mohammed bin Salman's national identity projects? Because when I look at the neighboring UAE or Qatar for an extent, there are conscious efforts by these states to include the expatriate population into the national identity projects. For example, national day celebrations or cultural events, or even teaching expatriate children about their national identity. So is there something similar in Saudi Arabia? That is my first question. Second is, how does the expatriate population, particularly the Muslim expatriate population, see the religious reforms in Saudi Arabia, given the transnational implications of these reforms? Because, for example, an Indian Muslim working in Saudi Arabia can carry the Wahhabi ideas back to his home and propagate that. So how does Mohammed bin Salman's reforms, religious reforms, is being seen by the expatriate population? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes, I can see you.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm writing notes. Go ahead.
Whenever I read about rentier economies, what really perplexes me is that why they could not utilize or leverage their wealth into creating a manufacturing base or a productive base. And you talked about the water problem. So there was a time when Saudi Arabia became a net exporter of wheat. And so why did the country decide to put their resources in building an agricultural sector in such a terrain and not utilize it to build a manufacturing sector instead?
Excellent question.
So thank you, sir, for delivering such a nice lecture. So I have two questions. First, if we see the development, we have to see in all aspects. You talked about the providing food, housing, and education. But I am very much curious to know about that what's the approach of Mohammed bin Salman towards the health policy, how he is trying to encourage the youth to go for the medical education and later on come to their own country and contribute. And I mean it will lead to the development, because a country who wants to reach the level of complete development, it has to reach all its aspects. So, what his approach towards it? And the second question is, the previously we have seen that Saudi Arabia providing aid lots of countries to build missionaries and mosques. So now we are seeing that the dream project of Mohammed bin Salman, that Vision 2030. So it needs lots of investment. So it will impact the aid the previous Saudi Arabia was providing to other countries. So it will impact to that, or it will remain the same. Thank you.
Okay, number six. All right. One more.
Thank you, sir, for the lecture. So my question was related to food security. Like you rightly pointed out that Saudi Arabia has been buying up land in African countries. So if we look at these countries like Sudan, for instance, like you said, these are weaker state structures, and therefore it is easier to kind of venture into them, buy their land, put their management there, and then take the produce back home. But however, in the longer term, these are not sustainable measures of ensuring food security. So, what, in your opinion, should Saudi Arabia do to kind of boost up their agriculture sector, given that it is also located in such a climate where agriculture is not hospitable?
Okay. All right. Foreign workers will have an important role to play in Vision 2030 for the foreseeable future, whether people like it or not. And whether or not the plans, all of the projects will materialize, will probably take much longer than Vision 2030 anticipates. This will be a long-term project. Some of these projects will take 30, 40, 50 years to complete. So therefore, we're talking about a long-term investment. And this international presence, which is, I focused on skilled and semi-skilled workers. But if you look at the upper skilled levels, you also have a lot of architects, you have some builders from the UK, from the United States that are involved. These are highly paid individuals whose skills are not found easily, and you have to really rely on them, because you're dreaming of creating utopia more than anything else. Some of these projects don't resemble normal urban settings. They are really out of this world. If you look at the NEOM projects, for example, NEOM, I will talk more about this tomorrow. NEOM has a variety of projects with them. All of them have very interesting names. I mentioned the line today, but one is called the Trohana. And if you look at the architecture, it's like rocks, buildings coming out of rocks, and it's really something, beautiful imagination, as Donald Trump would say. Everything will be beautiful. But obviously this is gonna take a lot of migrant workers' presence. And then when you finish with all these projects, you have to run them. You have to upkeep all these projects. It's not sufficient to just build them. It's like, for example, when you build a road, let's say you have built a freeway, okay, or a highway. Well, people assume that that freeway will live forever. Well, guess what? Freeway has shelf lives of 15 years. Every 15 years, you have to update it. You have to make sure that it's asphalted regularly, that the guardrails that are broken are fixed. You cannot just leave an infrastructure like this. In fact, in the Saudi budget, the last Saudi budget, 15% of the allocations of the budget are for the upkeep of the infrastructure of the country. A desalination plant that is working in Dhahran needs constant update in order to maintain the level of production that it has. Otherwise, it will not produce the water resources that you need. So therefore, migrant workers will be essential for the foreseeable future, whether people like it or not. In Arabic, sha'a man sha'a wa aba man aba. Whoever likes it. If you don't like it, too bad. You know? Now, there's a very provocative question about religious reforms and whether or not, for example, an Indian Muslim that lives there or carries Wahhabi traditions back to India. I will talk more about Islam and I will talk more about religious issues on Friday. But you have to understand that proselytizing is not something that is encouraged. You don't have to be a believer. You are free not to believe. Now, if you decide as of your own will to follow the Hanbali school, the Unitarian traditions, you notice I didn't use Wahhabi term because that's a pejorative term. To call somebody a Wahhabi is like insulting them, literally, because he's a Muslim. He's not a Wahhabi. He's a Muslim. He's a believer. He follows certain traditions that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, when he talked about Tawheed, unity, introduced. Now, you might not agree with the unity quest. Fine. That's what he believes. He doesn't want you to believe that. You're free to believe it or not to believe it. He believes it, which is fine. Now, whether or not an Indian Muslim that goes to Saudi Arabia and is exposed to these kinds of outlooks decides to do that, that's the choice that individual has. Whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, I will not pass judgment. I don't happen to be a Muslim, so to me it doesn't really make that much of a difference. What I have learned is to be tolerant and respect all religions. So your question is very provocative. We have to be very sensitive to these issues, and I will say a lot more about this on Friday, I promise you. Why put money in agriculture? Are they stupid? Yes, they were stupid to put money in agriculture. I'm being frank with you and blunt. Well, at the time, however, the logic was different from what it is today. We are now sitting in 2025, passing judgment on decisions that were made in the 1970s about people who did not know any better, who did not foresee the future. And unless you have a crystal ball and you know exactly what's going to happen 25 years from now, you're going to make mistakes. At the time, they thought, well, we don't want to have food insecurity, so we better grow our own tomato, even though each tomato costs $1,000 to produce. I'm using that figure as a figure of speech. It doesn't cost $1,000 to produce a tomato, but it costs a lot of money. But at that time, people thought, well, we need to have food independence, and they thought this was the way to go. But in hindsight, after all these years, it was a huge mistake. It was a huge mistake. And in fact, it was for that reason, excuse me, that they concentrated and went to the Sudan and invested in the Sudan as much as possible. And the question that was asked is very pertinent about food security. Will they continue to have that kind of relationship over the future? The answer is yes. because the Sudanese need to have that land to become productive. They don't have the resources, the financial means. Sudan is a poor country. It has a rich soil, but it does not have the resources. So therefore, the Saudi money comes in, works the land, allows Sudanese farmers to work, produce the food, export the food. It's a win-win situation. This can go on for a while, but eventually, down the line, when there will no longer be any food for human beings to consume, because we will all have tubes from which we will ingest food. How do you think we're going to travel to Mars and Jupiter and Saturn? Are we going to take tomatoes with us? You know, it's going to be difficult. We're going to have to get used when we leave planet Earth and go to the other planets. Then we're going to have to use from tubes. We're going to have to eat paste. We'll make sure that it's tasty. We'll put masala, a little bit of masala on top, and it will be fine. Don't worry about it. But obviously, the long term is a real problem. It's a real problem. Hopefully, human beings will be clever enough to figure out the options down the line. But you know, human beings are an experiment. You have to understand that. We're all experiments. We're all try and error. We're learning from each other. It's a trial and error process. And we have to learn, we have to adapt. Whatever happens, we have to adapt. One final point about the healthcare. That question was very important, whether or not health issues are a priority for Mohammed bin Salman and others. You will be surprised at the level of health care that exists in Saudi Arabia. It's very, very, very advanced. There are lots of Indian physicians that work in Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries too. In fact, one of the hospitals that I visited in Riyadh, once in a while I do these crazy things. I go around visiting schools and hospitals and places like that. The King Khalid Eye Hospital outside of Riyadh, where I see you are, you have view problems with eyes. They actually do implants for eyes totally. They take an eye and implant it to the eye of the patient. And it's an amazing hospital. You should look into it. The King Khalid Hospital, Eye Hospital. It's one of the most advanced in the world. There are 2 or 3 like them. There is one in Japan, there is one in Cleveland, Ohio, and there is one in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. It's very advanced. That doesn't mean that everybody in Saudi Arabia has good care. Obviously, such a hospital costs a lot of money. And if you have the money, you can afford that health care. Is Mohammed bin Salman encouraging young people to go into the medical field? Yes. There are lots of, the taboos about nurses, for example, are being broken. There are lots of Saudi women now who want to have the nursing field as a field for them. The taboos of taking care of patients. And you know, nursing is a very tough business to be in. Very tough. People don't appreciate what nurses do. They do a lot. And, you know, Saudi women, like traditional Muslim women, Arab women, are very conservative. And, you know, with patient relationship, both men and women, you cannot say, oh, I only take care of women patients. It doesn't work that way. You have to take care of both male and female patients. So therefore, the taboos are being broken. But this is going to take time. It's a generational issue. As young men and women learn the process, they become professional. That's what's important. They become professionals. In other words, you're looking at a patient, not at a man or as a woman. They're looking at a patient, taking care of that individual. That will take time. Give it a generation, maybe 2, but it will happen. All right.
Thank you. Maybe we can have one more round. Yes.
Thank you, sir, for great section. Sir, today we know that the Saudi Arabia economy depend on the majorly oil. Oil. Milli. Saudi Arabia want to diversify the economy like tourism. So from my side, my question is that the Saudi Arabia is simplify the visa policy or free visa because of the Southeast Asian area goes for tourism and for migrants large because India has a large number of population and for tourists like India.
Uh, my my question is related with the NEOM project. As you anecdotally said that about the agriculture that they were stupid at that time. So my question is, as we know that NEOM project actually it involves a lot of population, the construction and everything. How much it will affect the existing water issues because it requires water. If you are sustaining a lot of people at that particular area construction it all involves water. So is there in this vision they have a plan how to procure because you need a lot of water to sustain such kind of project. So that's what my question is.
Sir, I have this question again related to food security, the Sudan thing. So basically, when Saudi is investing in Sudan or all these countries, there are two big risks, even in short term. So number one, most of these countries are politically unstable. Today there is one government, tomorrow there is another government. So by overnight government is changing, so what they can do, the contract is in risk. And second is also that Saudi is not the first country to invest in all this region. Then other neighbors, particularly UAE, has been a pioneer in investing in Africa, in agricultural land and everything. So my question to is like for the political instability, what is Saudi's hedge? And for this geopolitical competition with other neighbors, what is the competitive edge of Saudi? Like how it can, what is its plan to beat other neighbors?
We will do it next time. Hold on. Oil income. Saudi Arabia today gets approximately 55% of its resources from oil income. It used to be up to 90%, now it's going down. It's going down to about between 55 and 60% oil, and the rest is coming from other sources, including industry, including fines. I talk about the decency code, and if somebody messes up, you have to pay a fine. Taxes, subsidies are being removed. You have to pay for your water. You have to pay for the garbage collection. All of these things now, there are lots of fees to pay. Even if you're an expatriate worker in Saudi Arabia, you have to pay for all the services that you get that used to be subsidized. So therefore, oil income is going down, and the whole Vision 2030 project is to reduce dependence on oil income as much as possible. It's not going to go down to zero, obviously, that's impossible. But maybe that it would reach that point in the next 200-300 years. But I will be long dead by then, and most of you also will long be dead, so don't worry about it. Let somebody else figure that out. We will not be around to know. So therefore, this oil income is critical change. With tourism from India, I'm not sure what the rules for India are in Saudi Arabia. In the UAE now you can get a tourist visa for an Indian expat. But in Saudi Arabia, I'm not sure. I think you still need to have a job. But for tourism, they're facilitating, and you can get transit visas, if I'm not mistaken, whereby you can stay for 72 hours and subject to renewal. But this is changing. This is changing. Why? Because Mohammed bin Salman wants to have 100 million tourists. 100 million tourists are not all going to come from Paris, France. They're going to come from Mumbai and Delhi and Goa, and they're going to come from Karachi, they're going to come from, Dhaka, they're going to come from all over the place. Lots of Chinese tourists right now. Lots of Chinese tourists. It's full of Chinese. And still, the Indian subcontinent will remain the primary source of all these migrant workers for the foreseeable future, simply because the tradition has been there. You know, as I told you, there are 2.5 million Indians working in Saudi Arabia right now. 2.5 million is not a small number. It's a huge number. And that's the legal number that we know about. Could be more, for all we know. Now, the water questions, these are very serious issues. The water question is, of course, not just in Saudi Arabia. Water has become a global phenomenon, and a lot of countries have to struggle with it, including in India. You guys are struggling with it too. Water is a precious commodity, and human beings have abused it. World population is increasing rapidly, and we all need to have water. As I said, you need 90 cubic meters. You know, you cannot do without water. You can live without food for several days, maybe for a week, 10 days. You cannot live without water. You will die. So therefore, water is a very serious challenge that a lot of countries have got to face. The irony, of course, is that a country like Maldives is going to sink underwater, and they will have too much water. They will have to learn how to swim. Political instability in the Sudan, and whether or not they want the stability itself. You know, the Saudis know about this, and they are trying to bring all these warring factions together, not just in the Sudan, but in Ethiopia with Eritrea, for example. They invited them to come in. You know the details better than I do. And you know, they're trying to make sure that there is some level of political stability in the Horn of Africa. Don't forget that in the Horn of Africa now, you have a significant outside presence in Djibouti. In Djibouti, you have the Americans, you have the French, you have the British, you have the Chinese, you have the Koreans. They're all over the place. Everybody wants Horn of Africa. And the Chinese, as you know better than me, are investing huge sums of money in Africa. And they're also doing it for market purposes, for their own policies. But the Chinese, they are very clever. What they do, they hook you on debt. They give you money, but you have to pay a pound of flesh with the money when you return it. That's the Chinese way. They're very clever people. Let's do one more round.
We can.
It's up to you.
Close
Yeah. One final round.
Do you want to take more? Or we can...
2 or 3 more, if there is anybody else. Otherwise, we'll stop.
Just say 2 questions.
Okay. But please, just one question each.
One question each. Go ahead.
We are running really short of time. And we'll meet tomorrow again. So.
Sir, data suggests that only 17% of women labor migration in the Gulf countries, while 83% of male labor migration in the Gulf countries. So, sir, in the future, is there a possibility that the female labor participation will increase in these countries? Thank you.
Yes. The answer is yes.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, since you talked about the foreign labor in the country, how different are labor laws for the non-Saudis and Saudis working in the country?
Whether they're different for Saudis and non-Saudis. Yes, they are different. They are different. Obviously, the labor laws that apply for Saudi citizens are very different, and this is why they have the Saudization process, whereby preference is given to Saudi citizens in certain areas. But in other areas, there is no difference, depending on the sector. In the construction field, for example, all these buildings that you see growing up You think that the Saudis are going to work 8 hours under the sun in order to carry up their back all this equipment? They're not going to do that. So therefore, the laws are different. Unfortunately. All right. We'll continue tomorrow. Thank you very much.